USS Enterprise. Comment response video. Let's see. What comments do you think we're going to have for this one? What comments do we think we're going to have? Ooh. Let's make this a little bit wider. I'm not sure why it shrunk down. Obviously, I've been organising things. Ugh, too wide. There we go. Sorry about that, but it's... I would love to say I don't have parts of me which are slightly perfectionist, but I do have parts of me which are slightly perfectionist. So, Patrick Radcliffe, if the United States struck a clause into a naval treaty about consumables, or maybe it was the Brits, the Yorktowns were built... in real life, the United States stuck a clause into a naval treaty about the consumables, maybe it was the Brits. Yorktowns were built with a big margin for bunkerage or fuel. This margin was used up as the what progressed. USS Wasp, not US, or not Ranger. Okay. Ranger is smaller than Wasp by 90 tons, standard, 1,564 tons fully loaded. Both were attempts to build maximum carrier minimum tonnage. Ranger was so bad that Animal King was happy to ask the British to borrow a carrier, hence the USS Robinson Saga, rather than deploy to the Pacific. Thanks for the comment. I think you were talking about the difference between the standard tonnage versus full load, but that wasn't the clause which allowed them to upgrade. That was the modernisation allowance to allow capital ships and other vessels World War I vintage to be upgraded to deal with the threat of air power. Radcliffe, Wasp, that was that 15,000-ton carrier. The Langley was converted to a seaplane tender for the USN to gain enough tonnage to build the Wasp. Ranger was experimenting in small carriers to compare to the large carriers Lexington's, was found to be severely lacking. They're both experiments in small carrier design. As the USN found themselves facing the same issues with cumulative tonnage and in the Royal Navy it was. They both have their issues. Wasp, 14,900 tons in standard, 19,423 tons fully loaded, is the more successful of the two, but she's not really that much greater than the Ranger. 14,810 tons in standard and 17,859 tons fully loaded, which is why the USN got into a completely different direction with the all-around excellent Independence, 11,000 tons in standard, 15,100 tons in full load class of light carriers. I wouldn't really call Wasp an experiment in that nothing really evolutionary was done. It was an attempt to get a full air wing onto a 15,000-ton downscaled design and only achieve 2/3 of that. Patrick, I know where you're coming from, but this isn't a good... let's put it this way. There are people to have this debate with. My PhD thesis was the development of aircraft carriers in naval aviation in the 1920s and 30s, and how the carriers... how the operational, technological, and strategic philosophies affected their design. Philosophies and influences affected their designs and development of both the air groups and the carriers. And I had to cut off the to get it to the roughly the 100,000, and I say roughly because it was actually at 110,000. Supposed to be 100,000, 110, roughly 110,000 word limit. I had to cut off the 30,000 word chapter on the US Navy and the 30,000 word chapter on the Japanese Navy because I had misread things and I'd written roughly 90,000 words on the Royal Navy and 30,000 each on the American and the Japanese navies to contrast and add as points to consideration. And I might have originally turned into Andrew, my prof at that time, Andrew Limit, something which was closer to 200,000 words, all inclusive, including appendices. And he may or may not have looked at me and gone, Alex? Yes, prof? When did you last read the thesis handbook guide for what to produce? In my first year? I think you've misremembered something. What do you mean, prof? I think you're a little over the word limit. Then it was a forest of cutting. Ranger was pretty much compromised from blueprints, missing features that would have made it effectively a fleet carrier, whereas Wasp already had the benefits of experience from Yorktowns and necessary components that made it an effective fleet carrier, minus protection, which Bureau ships accepted that risk. If Wasp had even a modicum of torpedo protection system, she would have survived that submarine attack, whereas Ranger's design was even more lacking in protection. Ranger served their purpose in that, and USN learned that small carriers for fleet actions were incompatible. Experimental doesn't just cover revolutionary things. In her case, it was literally take two. Surely we can do it now and build a smaller carrier. It's why the British aim for 23,000 tons to try to get a sixth from the 135,000 ton limit, while the USN, balancing Lexington and Saratoga, getting a viable carrier for 15,000 tons or less, that would do the mission range they require was the holy grail to enable them to be all the places they needed to be. It's one reason she didn't have the torpedo defense deck. She really should have, because if she had those, then not only require displacement, they also require space. So either you have to build up, risking getting top heavy like Japanese attempts. You have to build out, i.e. length beam or both, in which case you can end up with full-size Yorktown, or you cut something else. Trade-offs like that are how you ended up with Ranger. The difference between her and Wasp are largely down to what was traded away. She's still an experimental ship. She really is. And before you start going to me, well, you know, but once you know carrier, the Royal Navy only gets their light fleet carrier right, because let's be honest, the Unicorn, while she's a forward aviation support ship, then becomes the template for the light fleet carriers, and it pretty much is a light fleet carrier from the get-go. The only reason they get it right on her is, if you think about it, the Royal Navy's already built Hermes, they've had Argus, they've done all the fun with Eagle, Furious, Courageous, Glorious. They've built Ark Royal. So, Unicorn is also taken from the Unified Design Program, which will produce the Illustrious class, including Indomitable and the Implacables. And also had at its core a design which was not that far off from an Audacious. So, pretty much, you're talking the Royal Navy that they've produced a decent light fleet carrier in pretty much their third generation of design. Third, you could say almost fourth. And again, if you look at the US Navy, again I bring back the Independence class, who are pretty much their third generation of design. There's nothing, I'm not saying anything bad about the US Navy. And this is a point sometimes I feel I have to make quite strongly, because there are lots of people who, and I'm not saying you're one of them, Patrick, but there are people who comment on the channel who can't seem to discern the difference between critique and criticism. They can't seem to discern the difference between pointing out an issue and not liking, which is not the policy. The thing is, Ranger is still experimental. Ranger is definitely experimental, but she's first experiment. Wasp is better than Ranger, enough that they'll use her for combat. Not so much that she's a great forebear and they start building a class of her. They really don't. And the Independence class are interesting because of what they do get right in them. And they get a lot right in them. They produce a really cool class of light fleet carriers. And yeah. But they are their third generation of them. She only missed Enterprise only missed one carrier battle, the Coral Sea, because she was returning from Doolittle raid. Also worth noting was that she was sunk 6 times by the Japanese count. I think that's level pegging with Ark Royal, in terms of the number of times the Germans claim to sink her versus actually sinking her. Peter Shepard, thank you for this video. My father was aboard Enterprise as a crew member during the battles of 42, being wounded at Santa Cruz. Whenever I see the comic footage from the period, I can't help wonder if one of those sailors was Dad. Cool quote. John Evans, Saratoga is also my favourite, as my grandfather helped build her when he was working in New York Shipbuilding Company from what wanted in the middle 1930s. Cool. Dr. Monkey, I'm wondering if CVN 18 may get her deck number smudged a bit by to look surprisingly like 06. There's all sorts of interesting things that can happen. Well, Bill Cox. Doc, have you seen the wartime Popeye cartoon where he and Pluto are one man building battleships and sending them down the rails, bumping out like sausages, to quote a famous shoe-pounding bullman? That's how I envisage the Essex class. Imagine training all those new sailors. Now ask yourself from whence and where 30 new carriers are going to source their chief petty officers. CPOs are the ultimate authority on the systems, the gear, the mechanical and electrical parts of the ship. That's the part I find difficult to observe. We went from 3 carriers worth of trained experts to 30 carriers worth of trained experts in, what, 2 years? That's incredible. Yeah. And those CPOs, they're important. And it's the classic example I give. If you want to know an example of, if you want to see a good example of where you haven't yet had time to generate those people and you're relying on the people you have the losses of Courageous and Glorious. And then you have them having to move people around to train up next generation people for the new carriers coming through, etc. And then you have the issues that happen with Ark Royal. And that's entirely because the damage control personnel were thinking like battleship and cruiser officers, not carrier officers. A carrier is far more top-heavy than any of the other options you need to counterflood. Because when a carrier goes, it's going to go far more than the others, because of its top-heavy nature, because of its structure. So you counterflood automatically. And then you look at other ships when they're hit, and you go, well, they would say they counterflooded immediately. That's because that's the new generation come through who are experienced. You're not filling in spaces with people who have come from different backgrounds and who still believe in matches like it's the only enemy who lets water in our ship. Which is true. You should only let the enemy let water in your ships, but once they have let the water in, you then need to work out how you're going to deal with it. Your comment on armour high up brought this on. From my tin can sailor's perspective, the deckhouse iron of the large carrier makes the perfect visual range aiming point for enemy ordnance. Admittedly, the carrier is in a grave danger by that time from any suitable rifle or odd long-tom or chaser. Asking for a friend with a glass windows in his forehead, should a navigation bridge with a helm be forward below the flight deck? If harbour visibility is key, that seems like a good spot. In rough seas or high Buford numbers, it might not be the same, and so that flight ops should be in the island for best efficiency. I wonder if it would be better to separate navigation bridge from flight ops, spacing it forward in the ship's covered arc, rather than combining them both in a very obvious, amazingly vulnerable island. Your thoughts are most appreciated. It was tried, it didn't go well. Poor all-round visibility, and the flight ops themselves cause issues. Not to mention, basically, the noise and reaction of the aircraft coming down on top of you. Not to mention, in getting in the way of air operations infrastructure like accelerators and catapults. Basically, it's something which should work in theory, but in practice, limitations of our own engineering get in the way. Yeah. They tried it on a few things, and it caused issues. Let's be honest, the closest you can get to is Monaco and Elizabeth class or Trieste arrangement, where you've got 2 islands. Yeah. Sean Price. I always wonder at the deep affinity the Americans have for a ship named Enterprise. Is it this one's exploits in World War II? Is it our first nuclear-powered carrier bearing name, aboard which I have an uncle who served for both half as a Navy career? Is it the Star Trek influence? I have no answer. I think it's a combination of all 3, but I know I was angered when CVN-65 was retired with no replacement, and overjoyed when it was announced the 3rd Ford class will be a next Enterprise. That's a good one. Your comment on just how big the Yorktowns really were is interesting because there is clear photographic evidence of Enterprise that shows her draft only increased a couple of feet during the war, which does not make sense on its face. However, I think it's highly likely the ships were designed for heavier loading than the US Navy admitted to pre-war, and may have been built heavier than admitted. I also think it likely the ship was in fact closer to 23,000 tons standard displacement. I am curious as to the official tonnage number for Hornet, since she was not a treaty ship. I'd also like to point out that Yorktown at Midway has 2 boilers offline with a minimal impact on ability to operate aircraft. It is my understanding the liners were damaged at Coral Sea and cannot be properly restored for Midway. That kind of reserve power indicates the ship propulsion systems were designed in anticipation of a deeper draft and service requirement. I also find discrepancies of the actual completed tonnage as 19,800, 20,500 and the 21,000. I think it's also important to note a number of subtle changes in the ships in photos from the start of the war. US Navy played tonnage games like everyone else. I suspect their true tonnage on completion was over 21,000, and changes through the years simply added things to the ship that were designed for but skipped to meet this paper requirement. That includes ASW compartments designed as fuel tanks but not listed or equipped as such for initial use. A lot of tonnage can be saved by not installing the pumps and piping to transfer fuel after until they later refit. I also understand a lot of equipment in the aircraft areas was added later and simply bolted to existing mounts installed as build. Design was thus well thought out for the time which growth built in was, and else was shown by the Enterprise. Yeah. In fact, everyone did that. Honestly, they all... I would say the ones, in a way, the Japanese are the most honest. Because the Japanese actually, to an extent, admit they're lying. We know they're lying. Whereas, if you look at the British and American figures, still to this day, they are claiming they were being honest. And you sort of look around and go, were you? Were you really? The odds are no. The odds are no. Fred McCurry was best known for his role in the film noir Double Indemnity. In the 60s, he became even better known as the father of the sitcom My Three Sons. He usually cast the average American guy. Cool. Nah. The Yorktowns are an interesting class. They really are. They're a good design as well. They show where the Americans were heading. Okay. James 4789 again. To the point of the major repair after Eastern Solomons, Pearl Harbor's dockyard received an interesting boost and expansion in capacity as a direct result of the Pearl Harbor salvage efforts. Literally thousands of skilled men were sent to clear the harbour and salvage the damaged and sunk ships. Normal repair protocol went out the window to allow the damaged ships to be cleared and sent to the west coast. Using welded hull patches on the riveted hulls to save time is one example. But the effective result was in May 1942, when Yorktown was limping back to Pearl, the repair yard could pull thousands of men in to turn the ship around in 3 days. Detailed reports and photos of Yorktown were flown back, and the yard was able to fabricate enough structural elements to patch her. Our friends growing up had an uncle who was part of the effort. They trained the teams of men and drilled them for specific tasks and steps in repair days before Yorktown arrived. Cool. He said they were lined up on dockside, tools in hand, and teams were boarding the ship even before the dry dock doors closed. They went in, did their tasks, and left to prepare for the next task, and cleared the space for those following for next up. He said Yorktown was crawling with men, but everyone knew what exactly to do, and no one was standing around for direction. By the fall of 1942, many of the salvage crews were sent back to the west coast, but several thousand stayed on boosting the Pearl dockyards with men who had seen or repaired battle damage. I also understand men were flown in from San Diego who were familiar with Yorktown class for that Enterprise repair effort. Doesn't surprise me. And that I heard that workers had a copy of the Yorktown's blueprints because of Enterprise being stationed there since 1940. Again, it wouldn't surprise me that they did. And nice way, most major dockyards probably should have had those things. I think you'd wind up pretty close to Maltas and Midways. But what I think would be curious would be air groups. Assuming peak piston areas, the Midways are likely a full set of Bearcats and Skyriders. But for the British, I wonder if their World War II experience leads them to try equipping with twin-engine planes. But instead of the Sea Hornet, do they reprise the Corsair and try an air wing of only Tiger Cats? Possibly. It wouldn't be cool of all Bearcats. The F-8F was a short-legged bird. Very likely it has a small contingent of Tiger Cats for night ops, and mostly Corsairs as they were dual role and had a longer range than the Bearcats. It's an interesting idea. It is an interesting idea. Thank you, Stephen Richards. You could have had my Kennedy tickets, and I never used them. We'll see what happens in a few years. I think she sat high in the water due to the addition of a bulge later in her career, so she probably was 23,000 tons of sand, maybe 24,000 tons. All sorts of interesting things going on there in terms of tonnage. Enterprise was a very lucky ship not to be sunk at Eastern Solomons in August 42. A Japanese strike was looking for her while she was damaged and steaming in circles, but they got the wrong coordinates. I think they missed her by 30 miles or something. Despite the intel bonanza, the advantage the Allies possessed over the Japanese, the war in the Pacific sometimes hung on a flight of torpedo planes or dive bombers finding or missing an enemy task force in the middle of nowhere. It has lately become my conviction that even had the IJN sank our free carriers on 8th December 1941, the Allies would still have won that war. The fate of thousands of men, dozens of warships, and millions of tons of material hung in the balance, certainly, but the outcome of the war was never in question once their first bomb fell at Pearl. Well, I think I've said this before, it's an infrastructure thing. The entire World War II. This is why, if World War I is a stupid waste of life, World War II is an absurd waste of life. It really is. They really are. Because both times you have got powers who are structurally, infrastructurally, and, well, let's say, just to go infrastructurally, weaker, taking on infrastructurally superior powers in terms of their volume of it. And yes, you can go, well, hang on, land war, Germany was amazing. They are. But the thing is, you're fighting a war into France, and you're fighting a war against Britain. And if you can get it done quickly, yes. But if you can't get it done quickly, you are in trouble. So the entire German advantage with a land war in that scenario rests on them getting the war won within 6 months. If they don't win it within 6 months, the war is lost. It's just a matter of time. That's it. And in World War II, it's even worse. Honestly, if the Germans had... If the French government hadn't been so scared of the French army, the French army would have been, well, might have had better radios for starters, and then who knows what could have happened. Better communications gears, and suddenly the German movement through the Ardennes forest could turn into a very, very nasty manoeuvre for them. Because they come out on a very narrow front, and if you've managed to move forces to the right places, you could massacre that. Even with the French forces that existed in World War II, if they'd had radios and been able to get themselves organised in the right time and the right time rate. So, honestly, yeah. Because that's what happens when they're invading Poland. The Polish have nowhere near the resources and are structured more about facing an invasion from the Soviet Union, because they've been fighting wars against them, than the Germans. But still, even their cavalry actually do some manoeuvres which, when I talk about cavalry, I'm talking about horseman and cavalry, actually do some manoeuvres which come close to causing the Germans massive trouble. Massive trouble almost gets caused for the Germans, because the Poles, they might have the technological edge on them, but the Poles are smart. And they're coordinated and organised. If the French had been coordinated and organised, home court advantage, sheer numbers, and the built-in defences they have, they should have been able to do it. And then you've got Japan and Italy involved as well, and frankly, no. Just infrastructure-wise, no. Even the effects of naval treaties on Britain. Yeah, they've not got the same exhaustless, practically infinite maritime infrastructure they can draw on as they drew upon in World War I, but they are functionally still able to exceed anyone else in that set, other than America once it's built its full strength up. I agree, Hornet takes a lot of them. But I wouldn't say... I would say functioning and sinkable, perhaps. The trouble is they're damageable. Fred McMurray had a wonderful role in the somewhat sleazy Lieutenant Tom Kiefer film, The Caine Mutiny. 1659, 24th August 1942, after taking 3 bomb hits. Original timeline, Enterprise, I'm okay. Non-treaty compliant Enterprise. Bow to your new god. Ah. Enterprise was used in Dive Bomber. Cool. Also according to Barrett Tillman's book on Enterprise, Halsey had hated every moment of filming as it took up training time. On the day filming ended, Halsey told the film crew to get off his ship. In response, Errol Flynn stuck the finger up at him and jumped off Enterprise's flight deck into San Diego Harbor. That would not surprise me about Errol Flynn. I'd agree it would be nice if they named the Gerald R. class the Enterprise class. However, thanks to a small TV franchise that also named a hero ship after her, it's quite likely that one of the first human flights to Mars will also be an Enterprise, if it's not Columbia again. That's a big deal. CVN-65 was the Enterprise and the only ship of her class. True. But I was referring to the new CVN-80 and 80 Enterprise being built, which is a Gerald R. class. Although, yes, you're right, CVN-65 was... But she was a class of 1, so class of 1 don't really count as much. And whilst I can agree, you can say it's confusing, but there's the Enterprise versus the Enterprise class. Could the lack of appearing deeper be due to the addition of blisters that increase buoyancy? Perhaps, or just be low on stores. Enterprise was USS Vestal's regular patient. In the interwar years, USS Vestal various sports teams gave the battleships and big carriers more than they run for money. Yes. But they had more time to practice. Is what they would those battleship crews would claim. CV6 donated several portholes to CVN-65, which have been removed to be put in CVN-80. Does that mean her machine spirit has been passed into other hulls? I would agree with DGM Sniper, potentially. After 9/11, the CVN-65 lacking orders went to general quarters, and we were the first US carrier to strike back against the Taliban. I think we can safely say that yes, her spirit lives on. Well, of course you go to general quarters after 9/11. Yeah, I'm going with a mixture of both. And I wonder if there's a ship's bell which gets passed between them as well. That'd be an interesting thing. Look what kind of components get passed between them. If it's just portholes or if there's ship's bells, and because that can have an impact on a vessel, I feel. My coach, enjoyed the video. Your final comment on carrier design doctrine got me thinking. Battlestar Galactica, the new series, not the one from the 80s. Do you think their design doctrine looks close to the World War II US or Iron? I would say, to my mind, it depends which one you're talking about. Pegasus looked closer to US doctrine. All about the air group. Whereas Galactica herself looked closer to RN doctrine. It's about survivability of the carrier and the air group. So ones that, that was what it looked like to me. Although it's a long time since I've watched the episodes, but that was my instinctual reaction to that question. Natrowski, you are talking about the Big E. No way you end up with just 30 minutes. A certain Aussie anarchist YouTuber that got Drac to collab on Azure Lane themed video made 4-part videos several hours long total. Failing to meet a target yet again? Yes. It is Enterprise. Fate protects fools, children, and ships named Enterprise. I would agree. But please note, very close to this video being 30 minutes, so there you go. One of the Enterprise videos was 30 minutes. It's the common response.